The strongest fortresses in Europe were never destroyed by bigger guns. They were defeated by a single idea. September 1944. After racing across France and Belgium in one of the fastest advances of the Second World War, American soldiers believed Germany's western border would be just another obstacle on the road to victory. Instead, they stepped into a battlefield unlike anything they had faced before. Hidden beneath quiet hills and thick forests waited thousands of reinforced concrete bunkers that had spent years preparing for this exact moment. Their walls resisted artillery. Their steel doors laughed at rockets. Their defenders seemed impossible to reach. Yet within only a few months, many of those same fortresses had become deadly traps for the very men they were built to protect. How did one of Nazi Germany's greatest engineering achievements become its greatest battlefield weakness? Why did thousands of seemingly indestructible bunkers fall without their concrete walls ever being broken? And how did a handful of American engineers and infantrymen discover a weakness that generations of military planners had completely overlooked? The answer is not just a story about weapons. It is a story about innovation, courage, and the brutal contest between engineering and human ingenuity. It would reshape the battle for Germany itself and leave lessons that military academies continue to study decades later. As we uncover this remarkable chapter of World War II, you'll discover why sometimes the strongest defense can hide its own greatest vulnerability. By September 1944, confidence filled the Allied armies. Since the Normandy landings only 3 months earlier, American forces had crossed hundreds of miles of occupied Europe. Town after town had been liberated. German formations that had once appeared unstoppable were retreating toward their homeland. Many officers believed the war in Western Europe might end before winter. The 1st Infantry Division, famous as the Big Red One, had fought through North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, and France. Its veterans had overcome beaches, heroes, rivers, and determined German resistance. Nothing suggested the next obstacle would be fundamentally different. Then everything changed. On September 12, soldiers from the 16th Infantry Regiment advanced cautiously along a road outside Aachen, the first major German city the Allies would attempt to capture. The landscape appeared strangely peaceful. Rolling fields stretched toward distant woods. Small ridges broke the horizon. Nothing looked heavily defended. Experienced soldiers sensed something was wrong. The silence felt unnatural. Then the hills erupted. Machine gun fire burst from several directions at once. Mortar rounds landed with astonishing precision. Every approach suddenly became a carefully prepared killing zone. American troops threw themselves to the ground as bullets crossed above them from positions they could barely identify. The enemy was almost invisible. Instead of trenches or foxholes, German defenders fought from narrow openings cut into reinforced concrete, their positions hidden beneath layers of earth, vegetation, and camouflage. Only brief flashes from firing slits revealed where the attacks originated. American riflemen answered with everything they had. Bullets sparked harmlessly against thick concrete. Bazooka rockets exploded against bunker walls with dramatic clouds of dust, only for the machine guns inside to resume firing moments later. Tank guns blasted directly into firing ports, damaging the outer surface but failing to silence the defenders. For the first time since Normandy, overwhelming Allied firepower seemed almost powerless. The soldiers had encountered the western edge of the Siegfried line, known to the Germans as the Westwall. Stretching nearly 390 miles from the Netherlands to Switzerland, it consisted of roughly 18,000 bunkers, pillboxes, anti-tank obstacles, dragon's teeth, trenches, tunnels, and interlocking defensive positions. Built between 1936 and 1940, it represented years of planning and enormous industrial effort. Its purpose was simple: protect Germany from invasion. Each bunker followed standardized engineering plans. Thick reinforced concrete walls often measured between 5 and 8 feet. Heavy steel doors sealed from the inside. Carefully positioned firing ports allowed defenders to cover one another across open ground. Every approach was observed by multiple weapons, ensuring attackers rarely faced only one bunker at a time. The design reflected years of military thinking. Nothing had been left to chance. Artillery bombardments. Air attacks. Tank assaults. Even chemical warfare had been considered. Inside many fortifications, filtered ventilation systems supplied clean air while gas-tight doors protected soldiers from poisonous gases that had haunted Europe during the First World War. German engineers believed these sealed chambers could survive almost anything an attacking army could throw against them. For years, they appeared to be right. Ironically, the Siegfried line had spent much of the war sitting almost forgotten. When Germany conquered France in 1940, the Western Front disappeared almost overnight. Thousands of bunkers were abandoned or stripped of equipment. Steel doors and weapons were removed to strengthen the Atlantic Wall. Weeds grew over firing positions. Farmers grazed livestock around the famous rows of dragon's teeth. Some fortifications became little more than oversized storage sheds. But everything changed after the Allied landings in Normandy. As American, British, and Canadian armies pushed relentlessly toward Germany, Adolf Hitler ordered the Westwall restored to operational condition. Workers repaired steel doors, cleared blocked firing chambers, restarted ventilation systems, and rushed new garrisons into positions that had stood largely silent for 4 years. The defenses were old. The concrete remained incredibly strong. What neither side fully understood in September 1944 was that the greatest strength of these bunkers also concealed a dangerous flaw. Every pillbox had been designed to keep threats outside. Each airtight construction trapped blast waves. Each sealed doors prevented contaminated air from entering. Each ventilation system carefully controlled every breath inside. Those features made perfect sense against attacks from beyond the walls. But what if the danger came from within? At that moment, no American commander possessed the answer. No field manual explained how to defeat thousands of gas-tight concrete fortresses without destroying them. The battle for the Siegfried line would force ordinary infantrymen, combat engineers, and junior officers to invent entirely new methods of warfare under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. Their discoveries would not only open the road into Germany but also prove one of history's most remarkable military lessons. Sometimes victory belongs not to the army with the biggest weapon, but to the one that learns how the enemy's greatest strength can become its greatest weakness. The Siegfried line and early battles, aproximadamente igual a 1,050 words. The first week alone the Siegfried line shattered every assumption the Allied commanders had made about fighting inside Germany. Across France, American forces had mastered a reliable formula. Reconnaissance located German positions. Artillery softened them. Fighter bombers attacked from above. Infantry advanced behind tanks and captured whatever remained. The method had carried the Allies from the beaches of Normandy to Germany's frontier in just over 3 months. But the Westwall ignored that formula. Every bunker had been built as part of a carefully engineered network rather than as an isolated strongpoint. A soldier firing from one pillbox was rarely fighting alone. Hidden neighbors watched the same fields, roads, and valleys from different angles. The moment American troops concentrated on one bunker, machine guns from 2 or 3 others swept their flanks. Every advance became a deadly puzzle with overlapping fields of fire. Veterans quickly realized they were not attacking individual fortifications. They were attacking an entire defensive system. The Germans called it interlocking fire. Every bunker protected another, creating layers of defense that multiplied the effectiveness of relatively small garrisons. Even if one position was temporarily silenced, nearby bunkers continued firing, preventing infantry from exploiting the opening. For the Americans, every 100 yards felt like an entire campaign. Many companies spent a full day fighting for ground that could normally be crossed in only a few minutes. Progress was measured not in miles but in yards, while artillery shells churned the earth into deep craters and machine gun bursts forced soldiers to remain pinned to the ground. The greatest challenge, however, was simply finding the enemy. Unlike the dramatic concrete forts imagined by many Allied planners, most Siegfried line bunkers were almost invisible. German engineers had sunk them deep into hillsides before covering them with soil, grass, bushes, and trees. Their firing slits measured only a few inches high and were angled so carefully that sunlight rarely reflected from them. Many American soldiers later recalled walking dangerously close to bunkers before realizing they were standing in front of one. Sometimes the first warning came only when machine gun fire erupted without any visible source. Camouflage had become another weapon. American artillery answered with tremendous firepower. Hundreds of 105mm shells crashed across suspected bunker positions. Heavy 155mm guns joined the bombardment, shaking entire hillsides. Fighter aircraft attacked with bombs and rockets while tanks fired directly into firing ports whenever they managed to spot them. The explosions were spectacular. The results were disappointing. When the smoke cleared, many bunkers simply continued firing. Their reinforced concrete absorbed punishment that would have destroyed ordinary defensive positions several times over. Instead of collapsing, the walls showed little more than scars and chipped surfaces. The defenders remained protected behind layers of steel and concrete. Bazooka teams faced an equally frustrating reality. Designed to defeat armored vehicles, the rockets lacked the penetrating power needed against several feet of reinforced concrete. Even direct hits rarely produced meaningful damage. The explosions looked impressive from a distance, but inside the bunkers, German crews often continued operating almost immediately. The weapon that had become famous in previous campaigns suddenly seemed almost powerless. American tank crews discovered similar limitations. Sherman tanks maneuvered dangerously close whenever terrain allowed, firing armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds directly into bunker embrasures. Occasionally, debris temporarily blocked a firing slit or damaged a machine gun mount. But destroying the bunker itself remained almost impossible. Every failed attack carried a heavy cost. The Germans understood their advantage and exploited it with remarkable discipline. Rather than wasting ammunition, machine gun crews waited until American troops entered carefully prepared killing zones before opening fire. Mortar crews had already registered roads, bridges, and open fields long before the battle began. Within seconds of spotting movement, shells landed with frightening accuracy. The battlefield itself had become a weapon. Adding to the challenge were the famous dragon's teeth, rows of reinforced concrete obstacles designed to slow or redirect tanks into areas covered by anti-tank guns and hidden bunkers. Engineers attempting to clear passages often found themselves under concentrated fire before they could begin their work. Every obstacle delayed the advance. Every delay exposed more men to enemy fire. By late September, commanders recognized an uncomfortable truth. Superior firepower alone would not break the Siegfried line. The problem was not courage. American infantry repeatedly demonstrated extraordinary determination, charging positions that seemed impossible to approach. The problem was physics. Concrete several feet thick absorbed explosive energy remarkably well. Narrow firing slits minimized vulnerable openings while protecting the crews inside. Heavy steel doors resisted demolition attempts from the outside. Every engineering decision strengthened the bunkers against conventional assault. The Americans were attacking exactly where German engineers expected them to attack. And that was why they kept failing. Yet amid the frustration, observant soldiers began noticing something unusual. Those who managed to crawl close to the bunkers discovered areas where incoming fire suddenly stopped. The machine guns dominating the battlefield could not always aim directly beside their own walls. Designed to engage enemies hundreds of yards away, the weapons had limited downward movement. Once an attacker reached the side of the bunker, he often entered what veterans called a dead space. It was one of the safest places on the battlefield. Ironically, standing beside a German bunker could be less dangerous than lying 200 yards away in open ground. But safety alone solved nothing. The walls remained impenetrable. The steel doors stayed locked. The defenders continued fighting from inside. American soldiers could now touch the concrete fortress, but they still could not defeat it. Combat engineers studied every detail they could observe. They examined firing slits, measured wall thickness, inspected damaged concrete after bombardments. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Every bunker, regardless of its location, looked remarkably similar. That was no coincidence. German military planners had standardized construction through the Regelbau system, producing thousands of nearly identical fortifications across the western frontier. Standardization simplified construction, repairs, and logistics. It also meant every bunker shared nearly identical strengths and identical weaknesses. At first, no one fully appreciated the significance of that discovery. Most officers remained focused on finding larger explosives or heavier artillery capable of smashing through reinforced concrete. Requests for additional tank destroyers, bigger demolition charges, and more air support continued flowing through headquarters. The answer, however, would not arrive from a factory. It would emerge from the battlefield itself. The breakthrough would come from exhausted infantrymen and combat engineers forced to improvise under fire, men who had crawled close enough to see details invisible to maps and blueprints. One of them noticed something almost everyone else ignored. Above the firing slit, barely visible against the concrete roof, was a narrow ventilation opening. It looked insignificant. Hardly wider than a man's fist. No one imagined that such a small feature could determine the fate of thousands of supposedly invincible fortresses. Within weeks, American assault teams would transform that overlooked opening into one of the most decisive discoveries of the campaign. The Siegfried line had been engineered to keep every danger outside. Its designers never seriously considered the possibility that the deadliest threat would arrive from within. The breakthrough, Bobby Brown and new tactics, aproximadamente igual a 150 words. For nearly a month, the Siegfried line appeared unbeatable. American artillery battered the bunkers day after day. Fighter aircraft dropped bombs that shook entire hillsides. Tanks fired point-blank into reinforced concrete. Yet every morning the same machine guns opened fire again, as if nothing had happened. The problem was becoming more than tactical. It was psychological. Veteran soldiers who had crossed France with confidence now found themselves facing defenses that seemed almost immune to everything modern warfare could deliver. Every assault demanded courage. Every advance cost lives. Yet the concrete remained standing. Then, somewhere along the front in September 1944, everything changed. The breakthrough did not begin inside a laboratory or at an army headquarters. It began with a combat engineer who refused to believe the bunkers were truly invincible. Pinned down beside one of the pillboxes, he crawled through mud and shell craters until he reached the side of the structure. Hidden within the bunker's blind spot, he noticed something important. The firing slit was no longer pointing at him. For the first time, he stood only a few feet from the enemy. Instead of trying to destroy the wall, he focused on the opening. Carrying a heavy satchel charge filled with blocks of TNT, he lit the fuse, waited only a moment, and forced the explosive through the narrow embrasure before dropping flat against the ground. Seconds later, the earth trembled. The explosion sounded different from every shell that had struck the bunker before. Not louder. Deeper. The concrete walls remained standing. But something inside had changed forever. The machine gun fell silent. When American soldiers cautiously approached and called for surrender, no answer came. The bunker had not been destroyed. Its garrison had. Without realizing it, that engineer had uncovered the greatest weakness of the Siegfried line. Every bunker had been designed as an airtight fortress. Thick reinforced walls reflected the force of the blast instead of allowing it to escape. Pressure waves bounced repeatedly between the walls, ceiling, and floor until the confined space became impossible to survive. Ironically, the stronger the bunker, the more deadly it became to the men inside. For years, German engineers had focused on keeping explosions, poison gas, and enemy weapons outside. No one had seriously considered what would happen if an explosion occurred inside a perfectly sealed concrete chamber. The answer was devastating. Word spread rapidly across the front. No official manual explained the new technique. No general issued an immediate directive. Instead, infantry platoons learned from neighboring units. Combat engineers exchanged ideas during brief moments behind the lines. Veterans passed discoveries directly to newly arrived soldiers. Within weeks, assault teams were adapting their tactics. Their mission was no longer to destroy concrete. Their objective was to get something through the openings. The new attacks required extraordinary courage. Machine gun crews laid down suppressive fire, forcing German defenders to pull back from their firing slits for just a few seconds. That brief hesitation created an opportunity. While riflemen kept the embrasure under constant fire, engineers crawled toward the bunker's blind side carrying demolition charges, flamethrowers, or grenades. Every second counted. Every movement took place under the watchful eyes of neighboring pillboxes waiting to open fire. Success depended on teamwork more than individual heroics. Yet one man's actions would soon become legendary. His name was First Lieutenant Bobby E. Brown. By October 1944, Brown had already served more than 2 decades in uniform. He had landed on Omaha Beach during D-Day, fought through Normandy, and earned a reputation for remaining calm under impossible conditions. Outside Aachen, his company received one of the war's most dangerous assignments. Capture Crucifix Hill. The hill itself appeared modest. Its defenses were anything but. More than 40 interconnected pillboxes overlooked every approach. Trenches linked one bunker to another, allowing defenders to reinforce threatened positions while remaining protected underground. Whoever controlled the hill controlled the eastern approaches to Aachen. On October 8, American aircraft bombed the position before Brown's company began advancing uphill. For a few moments, the battlefield disappeared beneath smoke and dust. Then the bombing stopped. Almost immediately, German machine guns reopened fire. The assault stalled. Pinned behind shallow cover, Brown understood that remaining in place would only lead to more casualties. He made a decision that would define the battle. Turning to his men, he ordered them to bring flamethrowers, demolition charges, and suppressive fire. Then he advanced alone. Bullets tore through the air as he crossed nearly 100 yards of exposed ground. Using shell craters for cover, Brown reached the first bunker's blind side. Finding a damaged opening near the entrance, he forced a satchel charge inside before diving away. The explosion echoed across the hillside. Moments later, stunned German defenders emerged and surrendered. Brown did not pause. He returned for another demolition charge. Then another. Moving from bunker to bunker, he repeated the same method under relentless enemy fire. At one pillbox, he spotted a German soldier carrying ammunition toward the entrance. As the heavy steel door opened, Brown seized the opportunity. Before it could close, he rushed forward and threw demolition charges through the doorway. The resulting explosion eliminated another defensive position and shattered the carefully coordinated crossfire protecting the hill. Within minutes, the entire defensive network began collapsing. Each captured bunker weakened the next. The Germans had designed the fortifications to protect one another. Once several key positions fell, the entire system unraveled. Brown's company captured Crucifix Hill, opening the way toward Aachen and demonstrating a new reality. The Siegfried line could be defeated. Not by overwhelming firepower. By understanding how it worked. Brown later received the Medal of Honor, but perhaps his greatest contribution was proving that courage combined with innovation could overcome engineering once believed impossible to defeat. His actions quickly influenced American tactics across the Western Front. Assault teams became highly specialized. Typically consisting of 5 or 6 soldiers, every member understood multiple roles. If the flamethrower operator became a casualty, another soldier immediately took over. If the engineer carrying demolition charges fell, someone else completed the mission. Flexibility became essential. The sequence soon followed a familiar pattern. Automatic weapons suppressed the firing slit. Engineers advanced along the blind side. Demolition charges targeted openings whenever possible. If no entrance existed, another weakness offered itself. Every Regelbau bunker required fresh air. Ventilation shafts extended from the interior to the surface, supplying oxygen to sealed chambers through sophisticated filtration systems. They were far too small for a person. But they were large enough for carefully placed explosives or specialized grenades. White phosphorus proved especially effective. Unlike fragmentation grenades, whose effects remained relatively localized, white phosphorus produced dense smoke and intense heat inside confined spaces. The very ventilation network designed to protect German defenders now distributed the effects throughout the bunker itself. Again, the engineering worked exactly as intended. It simply worked against its own occupants. Flamethrowers introduced another devastating innovation. Rather than burning through reinforced concrete, they projected burning fuel into openings, rapidly consuming oxygen within sealed chambers. Many defenders surrendered before flames reached them, recognizing that remaining inside could quickly become impossible. Every successful assault reinforced the same lesson. The Americans no longer fought the bunker's strength. They exploited its design. The Siegfried line had not become weaker. American soldiers had simply learned to think differently. By late autumn 1944, what had begun as battlefield improvisation evolved into a systematic method taught throughout frontline units. Germany's greatest defensive masterpiece had lost its greatest advantage. The walls still stood. The concrete still resisted artillery. The steel doors still sealed perfectly. But none of those features mattered once determined soldiers found a way inside. The balance of the campaign had shifted. The question was no longer whether the Siegfried line could be broken. The new question was whether the Germans could adapt before the Allies perfected these revolutionary tactics, and before the road into the heart of Germany finally opened. Final battles, legacy and powerful ending, aproximadamente igual a 150 words. By the winter of 1944, the battle for the Siegfried line had entered a new phase. The Americans had solved the mystery of the bunkers. Now the Germans were determined to solve the Americans. Every successful assault forced German commanders to adapt. Engineers strengthened bunker entrances with additional obstacles. New minefields appeared overnight. Hidden explosive charges were buried along the blind sides where American assault teams preferred to approach. Rear doors received extra protection, while communication trenches allowed defenders to counterattack positions that had already fallen. The contest had become a race of innovation. Every Allied breakthrough produced a German response. Every German response demanded another Allied solution. But one problem continued to frustrate American commanders more than any other. Capturing a bunker was not enough. Again and again, infantry units fought through intense machine gun fire, eliminated or captured the defenders, and continued their advance. Yet after nightfall, German soldiers slipped back through communication trenches, reopened the heavy steel doors, and occupied the very same fortifications. By dawn, the machine guns were firing once more. Entire companies found themselves attacking identical bunkers for a second, or even a third, time. Veterans joked bitterly that the concrete seemed impossible to kill. The joke hid a painful reality. Every repeated assault meant more casualties. More ammunition. More time. The Americans realized they needed a permanent solution. Destroying the defenders was no longer enough. The bunkers themselves had to become unusable. Combat engineers increased the amount of demolition charges carried during assaults whenever possible, collapsing entrances and damaging firing ports beyond repair. Yet explosives remained limited, and frontline units rarely possessed enough TNT to reduce every bunker to rubble. Then another unexpected idea emerged. If the walls could not be broken, perhaps they could simply be buried. Modified Sherman tanks equipped with heavy bulldozer blades, known as tank dozers, began appearing along the front. Originally intended for engineering work, these vehicles found an entirely new purpose. Instead of firing at a bunker, the tank advanced to its blind side and lowered its massive steel blade. Then it pushed. Earth. Rock. Broken trees. Collapsed debris. Everything was forced against the bunker's entrances, firing slits, and ventilation openings until the structure disappeared beneath tons of soil. The bunker remained intact. Its defenders remained inside. But every exit had vanished. The ventilation system stopped drawing fresh air. The gas-tight doors that had once protected the garrison now trapped them inside their own fortress. The strongest bunker on the battlefield had become the most effective prison. Faced with rapidly diminishing oxygen and no practical escape route, many German defenders surrendered rather than wait for the inevitable. Once again, the very engineering designed to protect them had become their greatest enemy. The Germans fought back with determination. Tank approaches were mined. Remote-controlled explosives targeted engineering vehicles. Anti-tank weapons waited for bulldozers attempting to reach bunker walls. Several tank dozers were destroyed before completing their missions. But the Americans adapted once more. Infantry cleared the mines. Combat engineers marked safe lanes. The armored bulldozers followed behind, sealing bunker after bunker with remarkable efficiency. By early 1945, the battle had evolved into a carefully coordinated sequence perfected through months of experience. Suppress the firing slate. Advance through the blind zone. Exploit an opening. Neutralize the defenders. Destroy, or bury, the bunker. It was no longer improvisation. It had become doctrine. As winter turned to spring, the once feared Siegfried line steadily lost its ability to stop the Allied advance. One remarkable action illustrated just how completely American soldiers had mastered the battlefield. In March 1945, First Lieutenant Jack Ely Treadwell led his company against another series of heavily fortified German positions. The situation looked painfully familiar. Machine guns pinned down the advance. Concrete bunkers dominated the slopes. Several previous assaults had failed. Instead of waiting for another bombardment, Treadwell acted immediately. Moving across exposed ground with only a submachine gun and grenades, he reached the first pillbox before the defenders realized what was happening. Within minutes, he had forced one bunker to surrender. Tenanote. Moving rapidly through communication trenches and exploiting the standardized design of the German defenses, Treadwell captured multiple bunkers in succession, taking numerous prisoners and breaking the entire defensive position. His remarkable courage earned him the Medal of Honor. But his achievement represented something larger than individual heroism. By March 1945, experienced American officers understood the Siegfried line almost as well as the engineers who had designed it. The Germans had standardized every bunker. Ironically, that standardization now worked against them. Once Allied soldiers learned how to defeat one bunker, they knew how to defeat thousands. Within weeks, Allied armies crossed the Rhine River and pushed deep into Germany. The Siegfried line, the immense defensive barrier once expected to protect the Reich for generations, had failed in its ultimate purpose. Not because its concrete collapsed. Not because its engineering was poor. In fact, the engineering was extraordinary. Its failure came from a single overlooked assumption. Its designers believed every threat would come from outside. History proved otherwise. Today, many of those bunkers still stand across western Germany. Covered with moss and surrounded by forests, they appear almost peaceful. Hikers walk past them without realizing the battles fought around those silent concrete walls. Some have become museums. Visitors step through the same heavy steel doors that once sealed frightened soldiers inside. They examine the narrow firing slits. The thick reinforced walls. The ventilation shafts built to keep poison gas out. Standing inside those chambers, it becomes easier to understand why the bunkers seemed almost invincible. It also becomes easier to understand why they ultimately failed. The Siegfried line remains one of history's greatest examples of military engineering. Its construction required enormous resources, careful planning, and remarkable technical skill. For years, it represented the pinnacle of defensive architecture. Yet no engineer can predict every future battlefield. No blueprint can anticipate every human idea. The American soldiers who defeated the Siegfried line did not possess a secret superweapon. They possessed something far more powerful. Observation. Adaptation. And the willingness to challenge assumptions that everyone else accepted as fact. Instead of asking how to destroy stronger walls, they asked a different question. What happens if we stop fighting the bunker? And make the bunker fight itself? That simple change in thinking transformed one of Europe's strongest defensive systems into a series of isolated traps. It shortened the road into Germany. It saved countless Allied lives that might otherwise have been lost in repeated frontal assaults. And it demonstrated a lesson that extends far beyond the battlefields of World War II. Technology alone never guarantees victory. Even the strongest fortress contains weaknesses if someone is patient enough to look for them. The story of the Siegfried line is therefore not simply about concrete, steel, or military tactics. It is about human ingenuity overcoming seemingly impossible obstacles. It is about ordinary soldiers making extraordinary decisions under unimaginable pressure. And it reminds us that throughout history, wars have often been decided not by the strongest weapons, but by the smartest ideas. As the forests of Western Germany quietly reclaim these forgotten bunkers, they stand as silent monuments to both engineering brilliance and human resilience. Their walls are still standing. Their steel doors still exist. Their concrete remains remarkably strong. But history remembers something far more important than the structures themselves. It remembers the men who discovered that every fortress, no matter how powerful, has a weakness waiting to be found.